And then last but not least, Emyr. Emyr, if you're there, I hope you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah,
okay.
Can you hear me?
Take it away.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. If you can just move to the slide, that would be great, Koen. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I'm speaking to you from West Wales, and I'm responsible for a suite of exams for adult learners of Welsh. I'd like to use a few minutes of my presentation just to throw in a few ideas about less commonly taught languages from the point of view of a language testing practitioner like myself, and particularly for the assessment of Welsh. The challenges we face as test providers are plentiful, as Ina just said. We know that interest in learning languages has been waning for decades, as Koen pointed out, and this is true in Wales as take up in modern foreign languages in schools. Since 2019, there's been a 10% drop at GCSE level, which is 16 years old, and a 16% drop at A level, just since 2019. The situation for Welsh is rather different, which is compulsory in schools until the age of 16, but the number taking Welsh at A level has gone down. And we hope that a new curriculum and changes to qualifications at GCSE level, well, we hope this will address this decline in the coming years. How the pandemic will affect take-up and the choices made by young people remains to be seen, and is something we can only speculate about. But the recent trend has certainly been downward, which must be a concern for all involved in language education. In some respects, Welsh is different to modern foreign languages and different to the contexts of the languages represented by Ina and Dina, my colleagues here. Having fewer candidates and fewer learners, and by implication, fewer speakers, is an existential threat to the language itself. According to the UNESCO Index of Endangered Languages, Welsh is in the vulnerable category, which is next to the safe category. And there are 4 categories below vulnerable. So there's a greater sense of urgency associated with teaching and assessing a language such as Welsh. This concern is recognised at policy level, and Welsh Government has adopted a policy and strategy with the explicit aim of reversing language shift and the aim of increasing the number of Welsh speakers to 1 million by the year 2050, which is ambitious as it is distant. I think I'll be in my mid-80s by the time we know if this policy has achieved its aim. Okay. But anyway, rather than focus on the narrative of endangerment, I'd like to spend just a few minutes on the idea that there are distinct advantages to working in a field of teaching and assessing less commonly taught languages. I could talk about the problems we face, a shortage of teachers, suitable examiners and interlocutors for our tests, research, resources, but just for a minute, it may be worth considering the advantages of working in a small teaching and testing community. And to this end, I've shamelessly plagiarized the phrase popularized by the German economist E.F. Schumacher, whose most famous book was called "Small is Beautiful, a Study of Economics as if People Mattered." It's really an argument against the premise that the large scale is always better in different spheres, particularly in economics, of course. In language assessment, statisticians sometimes perceive that small numbers are somehow less valid. 100 candidates, 50 candidates, 1, So at what point does the number of candidates become too small to make a valid test? That's a question for you. The approach that ALTI has always advocated is that any statistics, any data analysis or validation should be appropriate to the nature and purpose of the test in question, and of course to the needs of the candidates. So perhaps a case can be made for smaller numbers, assessment as if candidates mattered, to parody shamelessly again. So what are the tangible benefits of teaching and assessing less commonly taught languages? Well, one may be flexibility. Fewer learners, fewer candidates, fewer teachers, smaller centres. These all mean that changes can be more easily managed and accommodated. And the COVID pandemic has forced all of us to rethink our way of working, as Ina and Dina pointed out. It's forced us to rethink how and what we test. On-campus tests are not possible at present. So many of us are looking at remote invigilation or e-proctoring as an option, and there were interesting presentations earlier today about that. And this is certainly something easier to manage with small numbers of candidates, as I know from very recent experience myself. For our main suite of tests, we're providing just online speaking tests this summer. Candidates will be linked to an external interlocutor by either Zoom or MS Teams, and the test will be recorded and assessed externally. And we've had more registrations than ever before, nearly 2,000. So the benefits of being online are obvious. And it's a far cry looking back from the days when I started in this job almost exactly 20 years ago, and I'd regularly travel the length of Wales with a car boot full of cassette tapes to be distributed to raters. Well, things have changed, thankfully, in that respect. So as an award organisation in the UK, we can't provide learning or courses directly, but we work closely with the National Centre for Learning Welsh, which organises and funds course provision. And the speed and flexibility with which the Learn Welsh sector adapted their delivery almost overnight to teach online was quite incredible. So the pandemic has led to a surge in interest in learning Welsh, just as Ina mentioned about Duolingo. Duolingo reported that there was a big spike in numbers in the UK, with more people learning Welsh than they were learning Chinese. As a small language learning and testing community, it's easier in some respects for both to be in alignment, the assessment and the language learning, which was one of the goals mentioned by a panel just before lunch today. Language learning Welsh and the assessment of Welsh is always going to be comparatively small scale, but it means we have control over the whole exam cycle and can adapt according to candidates' needs and react to events like COVID more easily. In the case of the online speaking tests I mentioned, we're considering offering this speaking only option to candidates in future as well. Of course, there's a danger of changing the construct and so on, but the construct of the speaking test, it remains unchanged. Another advantage I'd like to mention just very quickly is the commitment of stakeholders. People have a commitment to the language and are often motivated to do things that they would not otherwise be comfortable doing, such as moving to teach online. There's a sense of stewardship among tutors, which would not necessarily motivate teachers of large, safer languages. And this in turn fuels the motivation of learners and candidates. And it's a comment that sometimes we see in post-exam feedback questionnaires. Candidates take tests, not because they need a qualification, but because they need to affirm their commitment to the language. I'm not here in any way dismissing exams for widely taught languages, nor am I suggesting that statistical analysis is not important. It is, of course it is. It's actually quite gratifying when post-exam analysis and item level data and so on, they support the subjective views of our experienced examiners. With small candidate cohorts and even smaller pre-testing cohorts, any decision about things like grade boundaries, we can't rely solely on statistics because they're likely to be skewed by even small changes in the test population. So our examiners and raters and so on must have a clear understanding of the test population and the expectations. In other words, assessment as if candidates mattered. So just to conclude, I think that Welsh, Slovenian, Romanian, and so on could adopt the small is beautiful maxim in the context of language assessment. We certainly don't need to apologize for teaching and assessing lesser taught languages. We know what the challenges are, but we need to consider the advantages as well. Okay, that's what I have to say. Many thanks.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Emyr. I think, Emyr, you have to mute yourself.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Ina, Dina, and Emyr. Just wrapping it up, actually, when we were preparing this and listening to everybody, I felt like there were definitely some trends that we could identify. And that's basically that all of us are kind of like keeping an eye on the needs of the language learners, that we feel the need to cooperate and collaborate more widely. But that is kind of like this whole pandemic and the move to online also created some opportunities for innovation, asks for definitely for some flexibility. And then finally, also kind of like still urges us to keep that focus on validity. So thank you very much. Thanks, Dina, Ina, and Emyr. We still have like about 8 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to step in or put them in the chat. Let me see. And that's Graham. Are you moderating?
Hi, I can if you want me to. Yes, so please do put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand if you want to say something. I just want to thank you, Kern, and Ina, and Dina, and Emyr for a fascinating talk. It's something that I'm really interested in and curious to find out. And I guess if anybody in the audience tests what you might call a less widely tested language, it'd be interesting to hear about your experience as well. We've got what, sort of 7 minutes left for any questions or comments, so do let us know. So do. Okay, everybody's being very quiet. We're all tired at the end of the day, I guess, except for you, Kern. You're bright and easy ready.
I want to say time for the rooftop drink, but it's a little bit early for me.
Lovely. There are a few people typing now, so we'll see if there are any questions from that. Was there somebody else coming up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Nick's coming up.
Hi there, guys. Small is beautiful. Okay, so I'm wondering whether you can also be more adventurous with small projects, which are person-based projects rather than massive systems, to experiment with constructs such as plurilingual tests, or tests which combine communication potentials across languages of the kind we've heard in some areas. So in Wales, Emyr, is it desirable to have translanguaging between Welsh and English or other languages these days? And could you move ahead with new constructs or plurilingual constructs if you're focusing in a much smaller community of practice with vested interests and enthusiasm and stewardship at the heart of it?
Yeah, yes, I think being smaller makes it easier to move and to change, and not to play around with the constructs, but certainly to be a little bit more innovative and adventurous. And as you know, translanguaging was something that was developed partly by people from Wales who are working in a bilingual context, and the work of Ken Williams from North Wales. One of the tests I'm involved with does involve a specific translanguaging task. And this is going to be, actually, it's live next week for the first time using remote invigilation. So I'm rather nervous, not about this presentation, but I'm rather more nervous about what's going to happen next week. But one of the tasks in that exam, it's a writing test, is specifically translanguaging. So it's aimed at people in higher education who are studying through the medium of Welsh, and they have an English text which they need to summarize and transform, in other words, to perform a mediation action on the text as part of the test. So yes, we're very interested, and we've always sort of worked in full knowledge that most of our candidates can speak English fluently. They might not be first language English speakers, but in our post-exam questionnaires, we've always found that 98% of our candidates say, oh, English is my first language, or I speak it very fluently. So yes, we have to be aware of the target language use context and adapt accordingly, I think.
And would the criteria for success on those tasks allow language mixing, not just mediation between one and another?
The candidate, sorry.
Yeah, so the mixing of Welsh and English in perhaps even in the same sentence or in the same discourse, where the switching is taking place within the discourse rather than one piece of discourse in Welsh and another piece in English.
Code switching is a really fascinating topic, and I know colleagues from the University of Bangor have done research on that. I have to admit, in our tests, we expect the output, what the candidate has to write, to be in Welsh. They're studying through the medium of Welsh in higher education, whatever subtopic it is, science, philosophy, whatever it is. So the output there is expected to not involve code switching, use of English sentences within what is written. So maybe we haven't quite been brave enough to take the step that you're suggesting quite yet, but maybe, who knows, as attitudes and perceptions change in future, maybe that will be the case.
And perhaps more, to quote from Brian yesterday, perhaps more appropriate in a lower level mixed profile at a sort of an A2 or B1 level than for an academic context and with writing, with spoken language perhaps being more where it might be acceptable. Just an idea.
Yeah. So raters are certainly trained to be lenient where learners use English loanwords in their sentences, because that's what Welsh speakers do. They
Lenient is one word, but you could say encouraging. Lenient is a sort of a word which is, it's a deficit, whereas what we're thinking of perhaps in plurilingual models is that if you can communicate, the resource is deployed appropriately. It's a positive, not a deficit which is being enabled, as it were. Anyway, getting off the point a little bit. Thanks for your comment. Anyway, interesting, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emyr. I'll be in touch with you. I'm very interested in that. We've come to the end of our time now, so I want to give a big thank you to Kern and Emyr and Ina and Dina for this very interesting panel presentation. I agree with Carmen's point there in the chat that multilingualism, plurilingualism will become the norm, and then translanguaging will enter language learning and assessment everywhere. I think it's starting in language learning, but how does it get into assessment? And it's great to hear from language environments that don't involve English, and that's one of the key aspects of ALTE's work. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's formal program, which is fantastic. I hope it's been really useful, really relevant and rewarding for you today. And I'd like to invite you up to our virtual rooftop terrace for a virtual drink. So please leave the stage and find the teleporter to the back, to the rear of the exhibition hall to see you at Rooftop Terrace. If you can't join us, then we'll be back tomorrow morning, Friday, our last day. I can't believe it will be our last day already. The venue opens at 8:30 Central European Time, and we kick off with our first plenary presentation at 9 o'clock Central European Time. So if I don't see you in the Rooftop Terrace in a minute, then I'll see you at sometime between 8:30 and 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. All the best. Thanks very much.